Ever since I started working with epoxy resin, I always wanted to make some sort of a crystal style colored weapon, and since this was my first time making something like this, I decided to make it reasonably sized and made a dagger. This dagger is not specifically from any video game, but I was heavily inspired by two daggers from World of Warcraft. The first and main inspiration was this Ventir Covenant dagger, and the second inspiration were Valira's daggers. I knew I wanted something simple and made this sketch, and from that made a 3D model. This time the model actually served a physical purpose other than just a visualization, and that was for making a mold for the blade and this tooth at the end. Normally, molds for epoxy resin are made from silicone for molds because it's flexible, but I don't have any and I don't want to learn it yet. So I just 3D printed it from a PLA material and hoped that the separation material that I'll add later will be enough to demold it. The mold itself was very thin and fragile, but it held up nicely. Although the layer lines were visible, but that could just be sanded off later. After applying a generous amount of Teflon spray, I carefully CA glued the funnels in place and added a little bit of silicone to close the seams and to prevent leakage. Since I managed to accidentally burst open the silicone bottle, I had plenty of it to work with. Now I know to always make sure to remove the protective cover before squeezing as hard as I can and wondering why it's not flowing out. My main anti-epoxy stick base is just a regular wood hardwax finish that I painted on the inside of the mold. The main thing for epoxy to not stick to the surface is to cover it with something greasy, like a wax. I tried more different things, such as oils and sprays, but so far this method has always worked the best. During my time working with epoxy, which has been about 3 years so far, I learned a lot, because there are few things that are handy to know when working with it. But the main thing I would say is to just carefully read the label and follow it. I would say that I really like working with epoxy, but also sometimes hate working with it. Because the result, once you sand it and apply finish to it, looks amazing. And it is mesmerizing to see the colored liquid move and then turn the rock hard. But the annoying part is how incredibly messy it can be, and how sometimes it doesn't cure if I mess up, and other things like its toxicity when it's curing, or those annoying air bubbles. Anyway, after mixing it, I was really satisfied with this blood red color. It was important to do this process slowly to avoid any trapped bubbles. I of course mixed way more than I needed, so I just used what was left to fill in cracks in these oak offcuts, which will be used in the future for some yet unspecified project. While it was drying, I started working on the handle, which was very quick to make because of how tiny it was. When I was trying to find which wood to use for the handle, I ideally wanted it to have a natural crack to add more character to the piece, but I couldn't find any with the right size. So instead, I used this perfectly solid piece, which was actually nice, because there was very little cleanup necessary afterwards. After at least 3 days, it was ready to be taken out of the form. Separating these two parts was pretty satisfying, and also surprising how smoothly it went, because I thought that something would for sure get stuck. This part was a bit of a struggle, but when I managed to open it, I was amazed at how well it looked. The whole shape was nicely filled in, with no gaps. Well, until I checked the other side, which looked a little bit like a Swiss cheese, thanks to some air bubbles. But overall, a great result. Interesting discovery was the texture on one side, that was created by the wax brushstrokes. It was impressive how well it copied it. The small tooth part had a tiny unfilled part, but that was fixable. My next step was to clean and fill the air bubble holes, and fill them again with epoxy. Since I always make more than I need, I tried to make as little as possible, which was 14 milliliters, with the resin mixing ratio being 10:4. And when mixing such a small amount, it is important to be very precise with your measurements. And since mine or the kitchen scales wasn't very accurate, it can happen that the resin will not harden and turn into gum instead. And the thing with this resin is that if the reaction doesn't happen properly, it will never cure or something like that. So unfortunately, I had to repeat this process once more, but fortunately it came off very easily. One small thing to add is that I left it to cure for about a week, and it still wasn't solid, and I knew that I had to start again. But for some reason, after a couple of days, these, I guess, uncured pieces turned solid. This time I wanted to play it safe and mixed more resin, and while I was at it, I decided to make another one, but this time hopefully with less mistakes. I was aiming for this toxic green color, just like Valera's daggers, and I also decided to make a new second handle that would fit better with the green color and also feel better in hand, because the first one was pretty thin and a little bit small, but since it's just a decoration, it wasn't really an issue. There were once again no problems with unboxing this mold. Well, at least on the one side. The other one had some resin stuck in the funnel, but with a little push it popped out, and I was once again met with bubble holes. When I was filling in this second time, I always waited for a little while to let bubbles rise to the top and escape on their own. And I also shaked it every time to help them move to the top, but at least this time there were only a few of them. I guess I wanted to make it seamless, or I thought that I would add just enough pigment, but regardless I put in too much, and now there were these spots. But I think they look pretty cool. Sanding this took a pretty long time, but at least I knew that I won't have to make it completely scratchless and perfectly sanded, because I will later spray it with transparent gloss, which will hide everything. I hope. I have learned my lesson this time and added just a clear resin with no pigment, and after it cured I sanded it once more. Before I could glue everything together, I first had to shape the flat part of the blade so that it fits the handle. I wasn't exactly looking forward to this part because I knew that I was working with a fast drying glue, but I underestimated just how fast it can dry. Immediately after placing it on the wood, it was a little bit off balance, so I tried to nudge it into correct place, but it instantly stuck to the surface, and I wanted to rip it off, but it just didn't want to move. Discouraged by that process, I moved on to the next one, but this time without the activator, to hopefully give me more time to adjust it. But that gave me like 1 more second, which was luckily enough. I really wanted to redo the first attempt, but unfortunately, no matter how much I tried, I just couldn't separate it. Never mind. Having now one more chance, I carefully connected these parts together and managed to miss it again. But this time it wasn't as bad. Although right after that I still tried to separate it and adjust it, but it held there firmly and I just left it as it was. Since I already had problems in the previous part, I knew that this one would be even worse, because the surface of the blade is really small and also placing it in the center would be difficult, and also to make sure it's straight, but for some reason the glue just didn't want to dry at all. In the previous part it dried in like 2 seconds, and here it didn't want to stick at all. Well, at least for the green one, the red one actually worked, but at this point I realized that this was not the way to go. I had to make some changes to my plan and decided to carve a shallow pocket in which the blade would sit. I did this off camera with a Dremel tool and made it a little bit wider, because my plan was to flood it with epoxy. Before I did that, I had to do one more thing, and that was painting. I wanted this handle to be dark, and since this is oak wood, I used a mixture of vinegar and steel wool. Here we can see in real time how quickly it reacts with the wood. When we were making this mixture, a general recommendation was to let it mix for maybe a couple of days. But we kind of forgot about it and now it has been mixing for about a year. So I'm not sure if it's going to have a different effect, but it's probably fine. I mainly had to focus on painting around the perimeter of the pocket, but since I was at it, I decided to paint the whole thing. The other handle was painted with regular wood oil, and it is amazing how much more vibrant it looks with oil applied. I had to be a little bit careful around the epoxy, because I planned for the resin parts to be sprayed with a transparent gloss. One important issue was to find a way to have these parts connected for the duration of the resin curing process, and also keeping it straight and level. So I made this improvised setup from 2 types of vices. I made some additional scratches to help the resin to have something to grab onto. Before applying resin, I did a test fit just to be sure everything fits, and also added a little bit of silicone at the last minute, just to make sure nothing would spill over. Then I carefully lowered the blade into place and applied resin bit by bit. During that process, I had to play around with the positioning and loosening vices to adjust the blade and also adding or removing epoxy with a toothpick. At the end of this process, I used a laser guide to help me adjust the final position. And with that, I left it for a couple days to fully cure. Having this finally in hand, with everything assembled, felt really nice, just had to do some small touch-ups before I could start finishing. This handle felt a little bit rough, so I lightly sanded it, which created some nice edge highlights. I once more applied oil to this handle, even though it probably wasn't necessary, but it will at least have more protection. And then moved on to this one, applying the first coat, and it looked amazing. Wasn't quite as dark as I thought, but still the color turned out great. I got a bit carried away and put on too much, so the second coat wasn't really necessary. Also, these blades have quite sharp points, so that's why are my gloves so torn up. Last step was spraying on transparent gloss onto the epoxy parts. But before that, I carefully taped and covered the handle to make sure nothing got on it. When I was applying the third coat, I noticed that the spray can started malfunctioning and created these droplets all over the surface, and I'm not sure why that happened, but the spray can did this afterwards, which meant it was probably empty or something happened with the cap. Then I carefully wet sanded it and cleaned the surface and applied additional coats of spray. All that was left to do was to unwrap it and see how it looked finally completed. The finished result had a lot of tiny bubble holes and pretty bumpy surface, and there would be probably a million ways this could have been done differently, but overall it was a great learning experience, and in the end I was very satisfied with how it turned out.